Hi, I'm Eric McBay. I work with the National Farmers Union, Ontario, which is part of a national organization of sustainable family farmers. And you're listening to the 3 best ways to integrate food and farm into the classroom. This podcast is part of the NFU's Local Food Advocates Project, which is about connecting farmers with people in healthcare, education, the arts, faith communities, and other influential areas. So I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Marie Bencze. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm an organic vegetable farmer. I work on farms in the Kingston area, and I have for about the last 8 years. And I'm also a social and environmental justice community organizer in Kingston. And I founded a food and farm education project called Rad Kids in 2015. And it includes classroom workshops and a summer day camp on the farm that you, Eric, works and lives on. So I'm also currently pursuing a master's in environmental studies, and my focus there is also on food and farming with kids. So the kind of work that I'm doing is around connecting kids with farms and farmers, and trying to get a few of those first steps in kids learning how to grow their own food. And I think it's really important because we face this climate crisis and lots of other socio-ecological issues. And I want to be prepared for an uncertain future. So I think that we need to make sure that food is going to be available to all people. And I think that cultivating a love of plants and land and an interest in growing food in kids can really help us transform food systems and gain resilience in our communities.
That's great. Yeah, that's so important. And that's really important for the National Farmers Union as well, because of some of those broader trends in the farming context in Canada. We know that the number of farms has been decreasing in Canada for at least the last 50 years. And at the same time, the average age of farmers keeps increasing, keeps rising. So we have this risk of a loss of that crucial knowledge. In the NFU, we've seen that lack of intergenerational knowledge transfer is a big potential problem for future generations. And so we really need to engage new farmers and young farmers and kids as well, so that body of practical and cultural knowledge of farming isn't lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so that's why we're here recording this podcast. And we want to share some practical ways to integrate food and farm into classroom settings as a way to reach children. And so we'd really like to offer this podcast as a resource with some experiences and some research that we've done. And, hoping that folks who want to bring more of these kinds of experiences into their classrooms or their children's classes can listen to this and get some good ideas.
Yeah, perfect. So we've titled this podcast, The 3 Best Ways to Incorporate Food and Farm into the Classroom. And let's start with one of the big ones, school gardens.
Woo! So, yeah, school gardens are an amazing place to learn diverse skills and have kids see plants transform from seed to seedling to mature plants with their own eyes.
So how can someone get a school garden going?
So someone would have to be connected to a school in some way. Often it's a teacher or a parent who first gets a school garden going, and they would need to approach a few people to create a school garden team. This would ideally include members and interest on behalf of school administrators, custodial staff, teachers, and they'd really kind of need to get together and decide where they want that garden plot to be. So teacher roles, parent involvement, and curriculum connections are really important considerations for the team to come to agreement on. And funding is another big conversation. But school communities have plenty of resources to look towards. School garden teams can approach local businesses for donations, do crowdfunding and fundraising from surrounding communities, and grants are a great option too. Building a clear budget with items delineated for right off the bat kind of thing. So for example, you would say, we're putting in $250 for cedar lumber, $200 for soil mix, $30 for watering cans, and so on, can really help ensure that possible funders contribute knowing what their money will go towards. And targeting local businesses for some of those more specific donations can be really helpful. So if you went to your local hardware store and asked for hoses and nozzles, they'd probably be keen to do that. And then you could crowdfund other pieces. And this can be a great system for getting funds without overwhelming any one stream of funding.
Great. So what kind of grants can people apply to for school gardens?
There's a couple big ones. TD Friends of the Environment often comes through for folks. And Metro Green Apple School Program is also a good one. And those are for Canadian school garden teams. If you want to find a more complete list, I would recommend the Canadian Organic Growers website. They have a really great fundraising guide under the Growing Up Organic School Garden Resources page.
Great. We'll put a link to that on our website, nfu-ontario.ca, where we also have some other resources about school gardens and education that people can access. So what if a school doesn't have a yard with a suitable space?
Yeah, so school gardens can be small and creative. So one option, if the school is fairly isolated and there's limited outdoor space or bad soil for gardening, or if the yard is just already being used in other ways, is to use containers to grow plants outdoors, and that can be really fun and productive and beautiful. Students can use an array of items for their containers, like barrels or wheelbarrows, bathtubs even, which might be less beautiful, but depending on how you do it, could be pretty cool. And then community gardens are another great option. So often a community garden will have a plot available for a teaching garden, or one can be rented for a small fee. And there's many benefits to using a community garden for a school garden, such as getting students connected to other community members, sharing supplies, as often a community garden space will have like a garden shed with tools that folks who use the garden share communally. And of course, having a garden plot that is ready to use can be really helpful instead of having to break ground. So it can also be good if you're short on time or labor. So it really depends on the location of the school, though, if there's a community garden in proximity, to make this a viable option. I worked with a teacher a couple of years ago to set up a spring garden in the community garden just a few blocks from the school, and it made for a really nice weekly activity to have the whole class walk to the garden space, do some work, and see the progress from the seeds germinating to plants that came to maturity. We would do some watering and weeding and get the kids to taste the wild edible weeds. And at the end of the school year, we had our harvest day where we made a couple of huge salads in the community garden, sat at the picnic table. We had teams of kids working on harvest, others doing washing and food prep, and we shared some really delicious food. And we harvested more than the class itself could eat. And we ended up bringing a really good-sized donation to Martha's Table, which is in Kingston, a local charity that provides restaurant-style nutritious meals for $1.
That's really great. That's an added benefit to have the students not only enjoying the fruits of their labor, but also contributing to a community organization with their gardening efforts.
Yeah, and kids working in gardens really offers a sense of pride and accomplishment in those kinds of ways. And it also offers an interest in eating new foods because they have a real link to the food, to having done the work themselves to nurture the plants. They're more curious about the flavors and more willing to try something they haven't tried before.
Yeah. We know that kids are often more attracted to local or fresh food because there's a fuller spectrum of flavors, right? There can be more nutritional value. One of the things we see in long distance vegetable harvesting is that things get harvested sooner. They get harvested underripe so that they can be easily transported to the grocery store. And when vegetables or fruits are actually harvested at that moment of ripeness, and you're maybe even eating them the same day, they're just sweeter and more flavorful. They haven't converted as much of that sugar into starch. I remember a few years ago at our CSA drop-off, our community shared agriculture drop-off, where we bring our vegetables to our customers. I remember seeing a couple of kids unpacking the boxes, and they were maybe 3 or 4, and pulled out this head of broccoli, and they just got so excited they started pulling little florets of broccoli off of it and just stuffing it into their mouths competitively, like they were each going to be the one to try to eat the whole head of broccoli. They were just so excited. Their mom actually had to intervene and step in and say, no, we're going to save some of this for home, and put it in the bag. I think kids are often picky about vegetables because some of the vegetables that you get at the grocery store from further away taste more bitter. They're just not as sweet. I know when I was a kid, I was a very picky eater. I hated eating vegetables. Grew up in Northern Ontario, so things were definitely not as they were not particularly fresh a lot of the time. So we know as when vegetables are harvested, they undergo different biochemical changes where live sugars are converted into starches that taste bland. And so kids are attracted to those fresh local foods because they taste better, they're sweeter.
Yeah, and it really comes down to eating the food. That's something we really want to promote. If you want to bring food and farm into the classroom, kids should be eating food that's fresh. We want to help kids have access to eating local fresh food and developing a taste for healthy eating younger so that they have established those good eating habits. And we know that when kids establish good eating habits from a young age, they carry that with them through their lives.
That's so important to establish that foundation. And that's one of the reasons in the Local Food Advocates Project that the NFU is trying to have farmers cooperating with people in education, with people in healthcare. All of these different communities, our concerns are really overlapping, right? And we can solve a lot of the problems that we face by growing more local food, by growing food more sustainably, and by making sure that everyone in our society can access that as young as possible.
Absolutely.
So what other considerations should people take into account with their school gardens?
Well, they need to decide whether they want to grow just a spring garden, like we did at the community garden. So that would be all young plants that get harvested out in June. So things that are quick, short season crops, like arugula and radish and peas, those kinds of things. Or if they want to continue growing a garden through the summer, and then they can do some of those bigger plants that establish fruit sets, like tomatoes and cucumber and things like that. So summer maintenance can be a big task. And I know I've heard from folks who run school gardens that it can be really tricky to find people to take on the weeding and the watering, because gardens can't be left untended for 2 whole months. They might die during a drought, or the weed pressure could kill them. So often a school garden team will have a parent or a student volunteer, or, I would suggest maybe paying your student if you can find funding. That could be a great summer job. To have that person take on the job of weeding and watering the garden once a week through the summer. Some folks love having a garden to take care of, and they get the fringe benefit of harvesting things that are ripe before the school year starts back up in September. But other times it can be challenging to find that person because someone might take on the task but then not follow through, and then the garden and project will suffer. And it is an important role, and it shouldn't be overlooked or undervalued by a school garden team, so I would highly suggest looking into that and establishing your person at least for the upcoming season.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We also did a video, actually a couple of videos, about a garden at a hospital in Toronto as part of this project. So if you go to nfu-ontario.ca, you can see that and also see a little bit of a Q&A with the garden coordinator about some of the approaches that they took here.
Nice.
And if it seems overwhelming to start a school garden with just a small team, you can also look to those community partnerships for support. So locally, we have an excellent organization here in Kingston area called Loving Spoonful that has a project called Grow with school gardens at 12 elementary schools in our area. And they actually got a grant this past year to expand to 11 new schools by 2020, which is very exciting. They also have an excellent program where they offer 7 workshops that connect to the school curriculum over the school year. So they do various workshops that suit the time of year. In late winter, they do seeding. In the fall, they do seed saving, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Loving Spoonful's the best. So they have a system where they have a certain grade who gets to be the main caretakers of the school garden. So I think in some schools it's grade 4 or grade 5, and those younger kids are, they'll come by and they'll be like, next year I get to work in the school garden. And then I think it's grades 4 to 8 attend the various workshops. And so this is another consideration if you're setting up a school garden. Will all the grades have access to your school garden, or does your school garden team want to select 1 or 2 grades for more targeted learning? I was working at one of the Loving Spoonful school garden workshops last year or the year before, and a younger class was invited to do some of the outdoor seating with an older class, like a buddy system. And this was a really nice opportunity for older students to work with those younger students and provide some leadership. And they got to show off some of the skills that they had learned. Like, okay, they'd walk their buddy in holding hands and tell them to stay on the pathways so they're not compacting the garden beds. And then they would sprinkle the seeds carefully into the rows. So it was really beautiful to see that, and I think that's a good way to get some of the younger kids excited if they're just going to be in the buddy kind of role for the first few years, and then later they get to be the caretakers themselves. So yeah, it was great seeing kids working together and sharing those hands-on skills.
Yeah, that's so important. We love school gardens. They really offer so much depth and breadth in terms of the kinds of experiences that students can have in them.
Yeah, so school gardens, we're saying, are the first way to incorporate food and farming into the classroom. And number 2 on our list today is to get the kids out of the classroom and off the school grounds, going on field trips to become more connected to their food systems. Field trips can be so memorable for students with specific pieces of learning really standing out.
So where would you suggest a class could go on a field trip?
There's so many different ideas for where you could go on a field trip with a class. Teachers can take their classes to farmers markets, to farms, to join food security organizations on gleaning trips, or to seed banks. You could do a tour of backyard chicken coops in your neighborhood or backyard beehives, for example. I mean, really, it's up to what's available in your community and where your imagination can take you, and what kind of relationships you've built, which is often what it comes down to with connecting to local food. But I really highlight farmers markets as an easy trip that doesn't really require coordinating with anyone on the other end. So most towns and cities have a farmers market that's open on a weekday, and school groups can go during school hours, so that's really handy. And if a student has only ever been to a grocery store, going to a farmer's market can be an amazing way to show them a huge diversity of foods. One cool activity that I really like is to get some fruits or veggies from a grocery store and get maybe the same ones from a farmer's market, and get the students to rank the 2 in various categories. So maybe you'd get carrots from both, and then you could rank them on their taste and smell and crunch and the way they look and their price. And you could do blindfolded taste testing. You could deliver lessons on heirloom seed varieties. There are just so many ways to incorporate learning into this experience. And while at the market, students could, ask farmers various questions to fill out a scavenger hunt of information about the market and who works there. And discussions afterwards can be about what students saw or heard or smelled, or who was playing music at the market and how often they play, or if anything there surprised them, like if they saw something they just didn't even know existed. And you can talk about the season in which you went to the market and how different the market is depending on the season. So, we were there in the spring, we saw a lot of leafy greens. We're going to come back in the fall and see all of the different squash and, delicious full plants that take a full season to mature.
That's great, and those are a lot of great activity ideas. So I think what we can do is actually put a transcript of this discussion on our website. So if you're listening to this in the car or something and you want to be able to go back and find some of those suggestions that Marie just mentioned, you can just go to nfu-ontario.ca and read some of those yourself when you've got more time to write notes down.
Oh, excellent. Good idea. Yeah, I'll just add one more to that list, and that would be, maybe going to the market with a recipe, and you could collect the ingredients from farmers and vendors, and then the next day the class can work together to create and share a dish. And really, I just think the ideas of how to organize a farmers market field trip are so bountiful, but if you are going to do this, I would suggest making sure that you have lots of adults to supervise that day so that students can split into smaller groups and and explore. And also so the farmer's market isn't overwhelmed by a big group of 30 people walking through. And then some of the other field trip options require more coordinating, but are certainly worthwhile. If you could find a local farm that accepts visitors, it can be eye-opening for students to see food growing in larger scale farms and to get their hands in the soil, to smell the inside of a barn, or come face to face with a chicken or a cow for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that make such a difference for young people visiting our farms and other farms. And some farmers can support field trips, that's great. Others can't because maybe they don't have the appropriate infrastructure for safety, for example, for young visitors or large groups. I mean, there are a lot of considerations for farms with animals in particular, if there are larger animals. And farms that have larger production often have biosecurity rules about who can interact with animals or who's actually allowed to touch animals, and visitors aren't allowed to do that. So there are a lot of considerations, and farms can host tours when they have proper insurance in place. But there's a lot to think about from a farmer's perspective before some of them will say yes to bringing in big groups of visitors, especially children.
Yes, and this is the sort of thing that really requires relationship building. Farmers might be interested in hosting field trips, but they haven't been approached. And I would really encourage you to reach out to your farmers in your area with clear questions to kind of start that conversation, and expect that maybe a farm who hasn't hosted a tour before might be willing to do it, but it might not happen in a short timeline. So you need to get some planning underway. So you could ask, can they support a field trip with 30 or whatever number of students for this particular number of hours, and at what time of year, and then whether the farmer would be expected to run the tour or an activity, and therefore would they have to do a bunch of prep work, or if the teacher would mainly want to use a garden or field as a site to run their own material, which might be an easier sell. And farmers should absolutely be paid for these types of tours, so knowing how much you could offer should be included in those conversations.
Mm-hmm. That's really important. I think sometimes people, when they visit a farm, don't realize that the farmer is really working all of the time in the growing season, and when they're taking time away from chores, that's something that they'll have to make up for another day. Also, if you're looking for a farm, you can try contacting us at the NFU. We have 22 different locals in Ontario. And we might already know a farmer in your area who has maybe a diversity of different crops and animals that might be willing to host a visit.
Nice. Yeah. So if you could go to a farm, you can go to a farmer's market. And then some other options I think about are going to seed banks or going to a local seed saver. And these are not, they're not ubiquitous. They're not available in every town or city. But if you did have one in your area, understanding the biodiversity of seeds and what it means to have locally adapted seeds is really important in food. And so allowing students to do some seed saving or admire the countless varieties of seeds and all of their different, beautiful shapes and colors, or to visit a seed garden to see the stages of growth of the plants. These can be great ways to bring students closer to their food. And many Indigenous communities practice seed saving, so this could also be a good launching point to open up conversations around colonialism, land access, and what it means to be a settler in a place like Canada, which, for me, that's something that I would definitely want to highlight. And so we really also want to let folks know, if you're interested in doing this kind of work, food and farm conversations should really include conversations about colonialism and understanding traditional territories. So we should be talking about the history and the ongoing nature of what that really means and how it ties into our food systems. And many conversations, discussion points, and ideas for activities can come from these kinds of field trips. So before or after a field trip, classes can discuss issues like colonialism, and also things like climate change and nutrition and soil and water quality, biotechnology, GMOs. The list just goes on and on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think almost any subject or almost any part of the school curriculum ties in either to food or to land in Canada. So if you can't get a class out on a field trip, it might be easier to have a farmer or a community member into your classroom to run workshops with the class. That's number 3 on our list today. My partner Emily and I have gone into schools and universities many times to share lessons and information on farming. And it's the sort of thing that can really scale to almost any age group, right? So we've gone into schools and worked with kindergartners or grade 1 or 2 and done things around transplanting tomato seedlings or talking about animals, all the way up through, the secondary or post-secondary level, where we can talk about some of the deeper cultural context of food and some of the deeper historical context, as you've mentioned, things having to do with colonialism and international food policy and trade and economics and all of this stuff. And food and farming is really a way to help us to personalize some of those topics that seem really big and abstract. Because the history of land in Canada, that still determines the history, that still determines how we relate to Indigenous peoples, that determines a lot of the justice or lack of justice or inequality in our society. And when we if we approach that from a really abstract way, I think sometimes people, especially young people, have trouble engaging at first because they see, oh, well, how does this apply to me? But if we know that, for example, we're maybe eating food that was literally grown on land that was taken by force from Indigenous people, or we're eating, squash or corn or beans that were domesticated by Indigenous people. This really ties in these kind of broad historical or geographical issues into something that we do every day, which is, sit down and eat food.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that the deeper those conversations can go and the more meaningful, that's also a way for those big lessons to stick. And so inviting a farmer or, several farmers over the course of a few months into your classroom to talk about anything along those lines, or, crop management, or even what it's like to live on a farm. Maybe somebody's never been to farming regions. And so you can invite a community garden member or the manager of your local farmer's market, a seed saver, a backyard chicken keeper, a beekeeper, or anyone else that you think could help expose your students to ideas around local food and farming. And just make sure that when you do invite a guest in, you have the students primed and ready with questions.
Perfect. So to summarize, it's really about engaging with communities who are doing this work, doing the work yourselves, and being hands-on. Food and farming isn't mostly theory-based, it's mostly practical and grounded. Integrating food and farming into a classroom means touching soil, it means tasting foods, it means going to where some hands-on activity is taking place, it means being face-to-face with farmers. So before we go, we want to leave you with a couple of other thoughts and considerations. Social and environmental justice concerns linked to food systems and farming, and including these discussions in your food and farm education will provide much richer content and also address some of the lived realities for different people.
Yeah, and it'll come up anyway, so it's really better to preempt it. I've seen firsthand conversations between kids over their packed lunches, where some kids, have their fresh whole foods in their lunches, and they kind of made another kid with a packaged food lunch feel bad about what he had to eat, not because they were teasing him or trying to undermine him, but just because they were proud of their fresh lunches, and they were seeing, they feel best when they eat a lot of fresh vegetables and fruits. And I saw the kid with the packaged food lunch express himself saying, you're making me feel like a monster, which is really sad. And so this type of belittling can be preempted by addressing eating to groups as a whole. And so we need to explain why we have different types of eating around us. So concepts like food deserts, food costs, and access to people of different class backgrounds, and things like packaged foods being promoted to us by major powerful corporations, these should all be introduced to kids so that they develop a holistic perspective. It doesn't come down to just making good choices. And that's often the type of lesson kids hear. They, they're told, if you buy the right thing, if you eat the right thing, you'll be doing well and, providing a good service to your community and things like that. But really, kids need to understand the systemic issues of race, class, gender, environmental degradation, and the relationships of power that we live under. And this is really pivotal to giving the next generation the truth that they will need to be able to participate in building food sovereignty. So I'm happy to leave it there for now. And thanks so much for giving me the chance to talk about this with you, Eric.
Well, thanks so much for talking to me, Marie. And I think your closing comments really bring together the reason that we decided to do this Local Food Advocates project in the first place. I'm thinking again of that poor kid who is being belittled because of his packaged lunch. The problems in our food system, they are not problems that we can solve as individuals, right? I mean, sure, it's great to buy local food, it's great to support local farmers, but we're not going to fix this just by making individual choices or individual diet choices. We actually have to build stronger movements that can advocate for better food policy in government, in our communities, for food policy in institutions, especially healthcare and education institutions. And so that's the reason that the National Farmers Union decided to start to build a network of local food advocates, so that we can do that over time, so that we can actually solve these problems, and so that we can help also to address some of the particular problems that each of us has, whether we work in healthcare or in education or so on. So I really hope that everyone out there listening to this will participate in some way. I hope you'll go to our website, nfu-ontario.ca. There you can find other resources that we've created that are tailored to different professions and communities. So we've got videos, we've got fact sheets, we've got classroom activities, including a classroom activity for high school and university students about becoming a farmer, especially if you're not from a farming background yourself. So we've got all of these different things that you can use, whether you're in healthcare, education, the arts, faith communities, environmental movements, all of these things. I hope you'll get some of our materials there, and I hope you'll join our local food advocate hub, so you can see other people who are working on some of these issues on our website, and you can also put yourself on there so that other people can network and get in touch with you. So I wanted to finish by thanking some of our funders in the Local Food Advocates Project. This project was made possible by financial support from the Government of Ontario in partnership with the Greenbelt Fund, and also with support from the National Farmers Foundation. So thank you so much again, Marie, for speaking with me, and thank you to all of you for listening. And next time you eat, think about farming.